You're good.
Good morning, Chapel Cross, and whoever's watching. We are studying Bible study. We are in Genesis 13 today, as we have begun looking at Abram or Abraham. If you remember last, we did Genesis chapter 12, where we saw God call Abram from Ur, land of the Chaldeans. That's but it's mentioned in the Bible. And actually, when he finally sets out and actually goes to where God wants him to go, with the land of Canaan, he was setting out from Haran, which is between Ur of the Chaldeans and where he wanted him to go. So he finally gets to Canaan, and with his wife and Lot, his nephew. And Lot is a lot of trouble, as we see. But Abraham comes into the land of Canaan, and he starts at Shechem, and then ends up at Bethel and Ai. And if we want to draw our handy dandy map of the Old Testament world, and I may be a little off. So this is the Sea of Galilee, this is the Jordan River, this is the Dead Sea, this is the land of Canaan, also known later on as the land of Israel. Haran is up in this area, and Babylon, modern-day Babylon, Ur of the Chaldeans, I believe, is way over there. So Abraham's journey begins here. It pauses here. He begins to move into Canaan. I think the first place is Shechem, and Shechem is like right in the heart of Canaan. And then he ends up pitching his tent between Bethel and Ai, which are two cities that become very prominent in Israel's history. When Israel comes out of Egypt, and then they wander for 40 years, and then Joshua leads them across the Jordan River. He does so. First of all, they cross the Jordan River right about here at a place called Gilgal. And the first city that they end up conquering is Jericho, and that's right around the same place. And then Bethel and Ai are the next two cities. And I don't know, I think Ai is to the north of Bethel. It's actually Ai. So Abraham actually comes into the land of Canaan and sort of maps out the eventual conquest of God's people through Joshua. So he starts in Shechem, then goes to Ai and Bethel, and then there is a drought, a famine. And so you expect something like this if there's been a global flood in the recent history. 10 generations earlier, there was a global flood, so the weather patterns were messed up, so we start seeing famines. Now, the critical scholars will say this is a story that's made up because there's so many famines, and you have one author who wrote about a famine and another author who made the story up and made a famine. And then some author many years later took all these famine legends and wove them together and made a story. That is not true. This Bible has great textual, historical integrity. And the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947, I believe, near the Dead Sea, in a place called Qumran, tells us about the historical veracity of the text. Anyways, it's very interesting that the texts that were found were dated to 200 to 300 BC, which is amazing. We also have textual history from Josephus, a historian in the first century. The Romans sort of capture him and say, write us a history of the Jews and your people. And so all of this biblical and non-biblical evidence shows us a pretty good history of what happened. And anyways, so Abraham ends up in Egypt because Egypt, this is the Nile River, Egypt is one of the great civilizations of the world. Now, interesting also, remember we talked back with Noah. You have Noah is saved with his wife and 3 sons and their wives. So we have 8 people that make it off the boat, the ark. God chose 8 people because everybody else was so wicked. It's not to say that Noah was sinless. He was, as we saw, but he had faith in God. And God offers a way out of the imminent doom or destruction, and that is the ark. Now, those 3 sons end up having lots of sons and procreating the earth again. Interesting, if you remember the story where Ham mocks his father's lewd, sexual, whatever happens. He gets drunk. He probably has a romantic evening with his wife and does something lewd. Ham, the son, then mocks Noah, and Noah curses Ham and his descendants. Ham's descendants are Egypt. That is not just some random name of a country. It is actually a son of Ham, one of his descendants. And that's why people have settled here, and then they named the place after one of their forefathers. He's also the father of Canaan. He's also the father of Assyria. So Ham is the father of these tribes and many other ones, like Cush. Cush is Ethiopia, way down here in Africa. If you ever hear the Cushites in biblical terms, that's Ethiopia. Shem, or we get the word Shemites, is the father of the Arameans. Aram. And that's where Abraham comes from. So you have at work here, Abraham and his family are now sojourning, or aliens among the Canaanites, who are the sons of Ham. And now there's a big famine and a drought, so he's got to move on because there's no food. And he moves on to the greatest civilization at the time, at least the Western civilization of the time, and it's Egypt. And so he lies about Sarah, half lie. So Sarah is his half sister, and he says he's her sister. So the Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem. We don't know if anything happened, but anyways, God ends up striking Pharaoh with a plague, which sort of foreshadows what he's going to do to Egypt years later in the time of Moses. And eventually, this Pharaoh kicks Abraham out of Egypt, or out of his area, and gives him lots of more gifts. So Abraham becomes really rich by living in Haran and then living a little in Egypt. So in other words, he's looting by just living amongst these people. He's looting the sons of Ham. The sons of Ham end up blessing him indirectly. So we now see Abraham's going to move back this way to a place called the Negev. And in Hebrew, the Negev isn't an actual place. It's south. It's actually another synonym for the word south. So it's a the south part of the land of Canaan. So let's pick up in chapter 13. And we will just pick up chapter 13. Verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt. He went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev. So that's here. So this is a V. Yeah, it's B in your Bible. In Hebrew, it's a V sound. So he goes into the Negev, south of the land of Canaan, or the south part of the land of Canaan. Verse 2, now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place his tent had been at the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at first. And there Abraham called upon the name of the Lord. So Abram comes back here, and this is not the most lush place of Canaan. It is a south, more dry and arid place. And so that's why he probably heads back up to Bethel and Ai. Probably better water sources. And you also have some mountain ranges with also hills, if you will, with more lush terrain. So that's where he ends up with Lot. Verse 5, and Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they dwelled together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of his livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And at that time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. So we have our first controversy now. The drought is over. The problem isn't that there's not enough rain. The problem is not that the people who are indigenous people living there, the Canaanites, like the Perizzites and the Canaanites listed, are the problem. The problem is that Abraham and Lot are so rich now. God has blessed them in such an abundance of a way that there's not enough land to support these two aliens in the land. And they're not getting trouble from the other tribes, if you will, but their own family and their own servants are fighting with each other. So, verse 8, then Abram said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, and between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will take the right. If you take the right hand, then I will take the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. So they are in this area, and Abram says, if you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. And they're in sort of a hilly plain because Lot looks out, looks down, and he sees this area, the Jordan area, well watered. And at this point, it is not the Dead Sea. It's nice big water. You got the Jordan River, you got this big lake here. And so Lot says, hey, I'm going to go there. Plus, there are some cities and towns, civilization. It's going to be Sodom and Gomorrah. And so that's where he's going to go in this area. And then Abraham's going to stay in the hills, which is not the lush area. So notice how Abraham, he's the one whom God promised this all to, and yet he's allowing Lot to take the lot of the land. And which is fine, because when God makes a promise, he makes a promise. It doesn't matter what other people do. God's going to do what he's going to do. Notice the note then in parentheses, which this is actually in the Hebrew text. This was before Yahweh the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, a lot of people, we're going to read the Sodom and Gomorrah chapter, which we will get to, chapter 19. They want to make up that this didn't really happen and that God didn't really destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. The Bible is clear, not just in Genesis, but in other parts of the Old Testament. The prophets talk about how God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Ezekiel talks about it. For instance, I believe Isaiah talks about it. And the New Testament talks about it. In fact, Jesus talks about it. So we believe that God actually did rain down sulfur upon Sodom and Gomorrah for its wickedness. God did. We're getting into a very interesting chapter where Abraham sort of questions God on his justice and righteousness. And we'll get to that later on in chapter 18 and 19. But for now, Abraham and Lot are separating their flocks, their herds, their herdsmen, and Lot is heading towards the, I don't know what it's called before the Dead Sea, but towards this well-watered area, the land of Zoar. And that land of Zoar, by the way, Zoar, I'm going to write over here. The Hebrew word Zoar means little or small one. And when Lot leaves Sodom and Gomorrah, God tells him to go flee to the hills and get away and don't look at what's going to happen. And Lot begs to go to Zoar, which is a small city. Lot ends up not going to Zoar, to the hills, where God told him to go in the first place. So he goes towards the direction of Zoar. And notice also the language. Lot lifts his eyes up. He saw the Jordan Valley. It's well watered. The Jordan Valley here, it's well watered. Which, by the way, you read the Jordan Valley has got sort of they talk about it as a jungly area as well. and there are lions in the Jordan Valley. So watch out for the lions. They actually come up later on in the biblical story in the book of Kings a lot. And usually they are a sign of judgment. But that's a different time, different story. So in this area, notice what the language Moses uses. It is well watered, like the land of Egypt, which has a Nile River, and the garden of the Lord. Very interesting note here that Moses is saying that this area, which will become the dead area, the sulfur that rains down and destroys Sodom and Gomorrah and turns this water into a dead sea, which still exists today. This area was like the garden of the Lord, the garden of Yahweh. He's talking about the Garden of Eden. So again, you can't say, well, I believe in the whole Bible, I believe in Abraham, but I don't believe in any of the first two chapters of Genesis because it's too crazy and that God created stuff. It doesn't work like that. You either believe the whole story or you don't, because the whole story is connected. Even here we have this garden of the Lord in Genesis 13. And by the way, you have the Garden of Eden mentioned also in Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, and in other parts of the Bible as well. So yes, I believe there was a real Garden of Eden and a real Adam and a real Eve. Anyways, verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the valley, the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against Yahweh the Lord. So again, so Lot's moving this way, and this is Sodom and Gomorrah. This is the well-watered Jordan Valley, and Abraham's staying put in the central part of the land of Canaan. And notice the note here in chapter 13, already the people of Sodom are wicked, great sinners against Yahweh. So when God judges, we're going to see this throughout the biblical story. We saw it in the Noah story. He's not a racist. Again, all these people are sons and daughters of Noah, just like you and I are. When God judges, he doesn't judge you based on your race. In fact, God hates favoritism. God judges you based on your heart. God judges you based on if you have faith in his promises or not. It's a very important point. And we see this with the whole biblical story. So it's not like there's one theology in the Old Testament and a different theology in the New Testament. Or there's one God in the Old Testament who's this mean, angry judge, and there's a beautiful, loving Jesus God in the New Testament who likes the music of the Beatles. You know, it's like that's not true. People can make up whatever they want, but that's not true. So here right away, Moses is setting us up for moving east is never a good thing. We've made that point in Bible study before already. As early as the early days after the fall, God kicked Adam and Eve out. They went east of Eden. After Noah, they moved east to the plains of Shinar. That's where they built the Tower of Babel. Things do not happen well or good. They don't happen in God's way when people are moving east usually. So here, Lot is moving east to Sodom and Gomorrah. That is not a good foreshadowing sign. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look. Look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I'll make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. So Abram moved his tent and came and settled by the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to Yahweh the Lord. Okay, so even though Abraham gives up the best land, what does God come and do? God comes back to Abraham and he talks to him. And he reissues the promise. He says, look north, look west, look east, look south, and as far as you can see, all this land I'm giving to you and to your offspring. And it's a very important promise. It reminds us that God doesn't just walk away. He is active in his plans. Something, he does it. So even though Lot might think he took the good lot, God is still working for and with and through Abram. And he's going to bless Abram. And even no matter what Abram does, whatever comes his way, the famine, losing the good lot to Lot, God is blessing him and growing his herds and Lot, or for Abram. And he's actually blessing Lot too. Now, if you remember, Abraham was never supposed to take Lot. And so by taking Lot, Lot is a lot of trouble. And here's another example of Lot being trouble, and yet God being patient with Abraham right now. He's very patient, and he's still blessing Abraham, just like with us. God makes promises to us, and we have faith, we believe, but then we do things that show, do we really believe? We do in our heart and mind, but we're weak. And we take God's promises all the time into our own hands. We do dumb things. We hurt other people. We hurt ourselves. And yet God has a miraculous love and patience that he works through Jesus into us. He not only forgives our sins, but he corrects a lot of our mistakes. And it's a beautiful promise, and like God is always watching over us because of Jesus. So the same God who worked on behalf of Abram is working on behalf of you. Now, that's not to say he's made the promises that you'll be rich to you, even though he made those to Abram. How are you blessed through reading the story in Abraham? God promises Abraham many possessions. He does not promise you any richness. He does promise you your daily bread. That's why Jesus teaches us to pray, give us this day our daily bread. But he does not promise you health and wealth and wisdom all the time. He will provide what you need when you need it. But what God does promise you is he promises you through the promise of Abraham that you will be blessed. All nations will be blessed through Abraham. We see that in the person and life of Jesus. Jesus, who is a son of Noah, a son of Abraham, who becomes a son of David. And if you look at the Gospel of Matthew, how does it begin? This is the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham, the son of David. So Jesus is the promised son who, if we go all the way back to the beginning, remember there would be a son of Eve who would crush the serpent's head. That's Jesus as well. Jesus is the son of Abraham who blesses all nations by his perfect life, death, and resurrection. And more than that, you get the promise of the land. Because while God says, look at this land, I'm going to give this to your offspring forever, he's actually not talking about this land. He's talking about the rest, R-E-S-T, the peace which comes by living in the land of God. And how do I know that? Because Jesus reinterprets the word land in himself. Jesus is our land. And yes, there will be a real literal land, place, if you will, in heaven, and then a real new creation that God will recreate for us. There will be real creation, physical body and food and people, and it'll be amazing. But Jesus, remember what he says, he doesn't say, look at the land of Israel. You will live here forever, and I will give you rest. No. Jesus says, come to me, all you who are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Jesus is in effect saying, forget this. What my father, what God, the Father said to Abraham was true, but I'm it. Jesus is it. Jesus is the land that brings rest. And through Jesus, we will inherit an eternal land. And this land is going to be perfect. It will be really a perfect land flowing with milk and honey, as it's called in the days of Moses. Well, that's all we're going to do for today. Thank you for joining us. We will pick up with Genesis chapter 14, another story that shows us how Lot gets Abraham in a lot of trouble. So we'll see that, and a beautiful story at the end of that story of a very mysterious man named Melchizedek who enters the narrative, pre-incarnate Jesus. So join us next week, Abraham, Genesis 14. Have a great day.
Now it flies by. Hey, good the numbers of people watching on Facebook.
How many people are watching?